Hello everybody, this is Ms. Peachy again from your WCA Biology B class. And now we are on to Unit 4, Lesson 5 on carrying capacity. So now we're back with our list of keywords. Don't know where that went the last couple of lessons, but it has returned, thankfully. Our keywords are abiotic, which we mentioned in Lesson 4, or I mentioned in Lesson 4, I should say, biodiversity, biotic, carrying capacity, ecosystem, homeostasis, keystone species, and population. So the terms that are kind of new here for you, kind of abiotic and biotic as well, because those are new in this lesson in biology. Biodiversity we have not talked about before either. Carrying capacity we have not talked about, or keystone species. So we actually have quite a few new terms that are presented in this lesson. All right, so talks about this picture of a coral reef. Isn't it pretty? And you can look at this and see how diverse a community this is. Every place that you see a color other than the blue of the ocean represents a living creature. On some level. Corals all are different colors. There are different bacteria that live here that all have different colors. So the abundance of colors actually is an indicator of how diverse this area is. Okay, here we go. And so it talks about something known as biodiversity. And biodiversity, if you look at the definition, the collection of different kinds of organisms living in a given area at a given time. So we're concerned with biodiversity. We do know that a healthy ecosystem has to maintain its normal level of biodiversity, right? Different ecosystems have different levels of biodiversity that are kind of unique to that particular ecosystem. Obviously, a coral reef is a very, very diverse area. So is a rainforest and stuff like that. Not all ecosystems are as ecologically diverse as a coral reef, but the goal of any ecosystem is to maintain its healthy and normal level of biodiversity. If any kind of activities that we are doing are impacting the biodiversity of an ecosystem, that can cause that whole ecosystem to collapse. All right, so it goes on to talk about how each one of these different organisms has different individual survival elements. And that's one of the things that I put in your study guide for this section. What do we mean by survival requirements? These are conditions that that organism needs to thrive, not just survive, but actually thrive. So we want organisms to survive, but in order to be able to reproduce and continue on that ecosystem to the next generation, we need those organisms to survive. Obviously, food and shelter are things that we think about immediately, but we also have to think of beyond the scope of what is obvious. For example, water chemistry plays a huge role in whether or not an ocean creature can survive in a particular area. Then it starts talking about something called ocean acidification. And ocean acidification is a byproduct of warming oceans due to climate change. So climate change causes the ocean temperature to rise. It's a complex process that we will not go into in this couple of sentences here, but essentially it causes the ocean to become more acidified. It can cause, put a lot of stress on the corals that make up kind of the foundation of our coral reefs. Corals are an animal that live in a symbiotic relationship with an algae. Those algae are known as zooxanthellae, and they actually live with inside the corals themselves. They're very particular, zooxanthellae. They don't like temperatures in the ocean to get too warm. They have a specific temperature requirement. If the oceans get a little too warm, the zooxanthellae get stressed and they actually leave the coral, and eventually that causes the corals to die. When corals lose the zooxanthellae, they lose their bright color. So the bright color of the coral is due to the zooxanthellae that live within the corals themselves. It causes the corals to turn white. It is a process known as coral bleaching. Sometimes the zooxanthellae will return to the corals again, so just turning white isn't immediate death. But over time, it can cause the corals to die if the zooxanthellae do not return, or if they leave too frequently, and that kind of a thing. And it can destroy an entire reef system. Because coral reefs are considered to be a keystone species. So keystone species, whoops, is a species on which the other species in an ecosystem largely depend. They're usually directly or indirectly linked to that particular species so that it's like a domino effect. That one species falls and it can lead to the collapse of the entire ecosystem. So ecosystems are impacted by living things and non-living things, by biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are living things or once living things in an ecosystem. Abiotic factors are elements that are non-living, like ocean temperature, ocean pH level, right? Those are abiotic factors. So ocean acidification is one abiotic factor in this ecosystem. And it goes on to talk about how you can tell which parts of the reef are biotic and which parts are abiotic. You have to remember what are the characteristics of living things. So living things respond to their environment. So some sort of environmental response. It doesn't have to be dramatic like the dog drooling. It can be something that's much more subtle like a plant just tracking itself with the sun. Living things are organized into cells, right? So they're made up of cells. Living things can grow and self-replicate. Living things are in homeostasis. They maintain a stable internal environment even when their external environment changes. And living things have metabolism. They can either make their own energy or they harvest energy from other things to be able to do their body functions. Okay, so we need to pay attention to those different characteristics. In the next slide, we talk a little bit about population and how populations will grow. Remember, population refers specifically to living things within an ecosystem, right? So when we look at this, we look at any particular ecosystem has what's known as a carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a particular species that an ecosystem can support at any given time. Now, carrying capacity of an ecosystem can change as well. It's not a fixed number. It kind of depends upon, what's available in the ecosystem. Things such as food and water and shelter and climate have an impact on carrying capacity. So where maybe the climate is such that there's an abundance of food, the carrying capacity might be higher than if the climate changes and there is less food available, then the carrying capacity can go down. Populations of organisms oftentimes will grow exponentially up until they reach the carrying capacity of that particular ecosystem. So this growth here is considered exponential growth because as time, actually this is more of linear growth here, but here we can see exponential growth right there, right? And exponential growth is, it basically grows in significant numbers within a short period of time. It happens at a constant ratio. We oftentimes talk about bacteria as really a good representation of exponential growth because you start with one bacterial cell and it splits into two, and those two split into four, and those four split into 16, so we just keep getting division of cells that can grow exponentially. And then at some point they run out of space, or they run out of food, or disease starts to spread. And those things influence the carrying capacity of that particular population. So we'll talk more about the influences of carrying capacity coming up in the next lesson. So moving on here, we talk about the population of people. And now human population has almost at 8 billion at this point, and that some scientists estimate that the human population carrying capacity is around 10 billion year mark, and it just kind of leaves the question of what's going to happen when the earth reaches its carrying capacity of people, and do we really know what the carrying capacity of human beings on earth actually is, because there's so many factors that affect that. But that's pretty much the gist of what is in this lesson, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.